For me, 16 isn't something that I get the opportunity to shoot a ton of, but um as of like the last probably year and a half or so, I've been getting asked for it a lot. And so I'll say as of late, like the last it's April now, early April now. It's mid-April. Mid-April now. Pretty much all of March was exclusively 16. And I have a lot of thoughts, both kind of positive and negative. I guess the big positive is like, I can add to my skill set and say that I shoot 16 and you have the distinct sort of look that comes with 16 that I think instantly kind of adds a level of production value. It sort of adds a certain level of like the seriousness to certain productions. Not that the work isn't serious, right? But I think something that I've noticed is, and I'll put this in the positives category. Um, I think probably one of the biggest things that I've sort of picked up on in shooting 16 is like, um, I feel like everybody's more attentive and a little bit more focused just in general. I think because the production knows that it's kind of a finite amount of media that we have. Whereas like digital, you could just keep dumping the footage onto drives, you could just keep recycling the media and you could just record almost like indefinitely. I think the finiteness of the physical spools, I think, allows it sort of puts pressure on the production to be more deliberate and focus kind of with everything you get. And I tend to enjoy those productions a little bit more. The pressure is definitely really high, right? Like I'm not going to ignore that compared to digital, but for me, I definitely found that like the seriousness and the attentiveness kind of puts everybody like dialed up to 11, and it's definitely it's one thing for me to describe it, right? But it's also like when you shoot 16, you'll kind of know like, oh, we gotta be 110% like dialed in on this sort of thing. We gotta make sure everything's right and correct and that sort of thing. That's probably the biggest sort of pro that I've had in my experience. And I'd say like a con, a big, not a big con, but like something to be aware of is like it's you gotta really want to shoot on film. It can't be like a half baked decision that you have. It can't be like an impromptu thing. You really, really, really got to set the tone like from the beginning to like shoot on 16. Um, and I say that because it's expensive as I think for a roll it's like 130. What would you say it is? Like 100.
62 divided by 4. 170 development and gold.
So, like you're talking about spending like 130 plus tax, like 170, for 100 feet, which if you're shooting 18 frames gets you like, I don't know, like 3-ish minutes, 3 minutes and some change, something like that. And you're kind of looking at your budget and you're like, oh, like, you gotta really like sparse out like, okay, if we're gonna buy like 6 of these, for example, it's just to cover like the whole video, just to get multiple takes of stuff, just to be like really sure that we're able to like capture everything. You're really gonna want to be deliberate with like, okay, this is right, and like even like little things like your focus. Especially if you're dealing with like, for myself, for example, if you're dealing with like the Bolex, it's very common for stuff to be like in and out because the little bull viewfinder is just like the worst thing to view things out of. And when you don't have like that safety net of just like, oh, okay, we can go again, that's something that is going to really hurt the production, right? Especially if like you try to go out something again and again and again. Like if had it been digital, it's like, oh, it's fine, it's not as like costly. Like if we're doing like another take of something, you gotta like really know what you're trying to get out of that take. Otherwise, it's like a waste of film. It's a waste of the time that you're spending on it, because then you're going to be behind on your schedule, especially if you're dealing with something that's like based on the time of day. That's another factor. You know what I mean? So um, I would say that I don't even know if that's a con, because you could even view that as like, okay, I want to be more focused with my work. I want to be more intentional. That's going to be the way that I approach it. And that isn't like a wrong way of thinking necessarily, but at least for me, when I was getting into 16, I sort of viewed it as like, okay, I can't be as like, I don't want to say like free, but I was aware of the cost, and I feel like when I was initially starting to shoot 16, it was definitely something that weighed pretty heavy on my mind, because I really didn't want to f it up, especially when I was loading like my bullocks and stuff. There's definitely a few moments where I'm like the camera jammed, or like I thought I loaded it incorrectly. But looking back on those projects, it's like, oh, okay, this was fine. It wasn't a big deal. But I think maybe for myself specifically, like that level of like paranoia and just like not knowing what's gonna happen when the film gets to the lab, is something that kind of is what I'll say is like a con. For example, like I just did a music video recently where it took a while to develop. I figure it was because of like two rolls, but I remember on the day thinking that maybe I loaded it incorrectly. But when we got the film back, I think the director had like sent it to me. He's like, "Here's the link," and I was like, he didn't say anything. So I was thinking like, "Oh, this footage is just black from that roll," or like I exposed something incorrectly or something, because I guess my thought was like it didn't feed through the gate correctly, and I thought it was just going to come out as like either completely just blown out or just completely like crushed image, like with the shadows and stuff. Um, that was just kind of my thought process. But when it came back, he was like, "What do you think of this? Do you think this is weird? Like this weird take?" And I was like, "Oh, okay, that's not what I thought you were gonna say." Oof, but I say that, but it's also like I'm at a point now where like I'm very comfortable shooting on film, and it's very, at least for the way that I expose things, I expose for like my highlights, so I kind of already meter for. This isn't anything like directly at somebody, but like I usually meter for people's foreheads, because that tends to be the shiniest bit, myself included. Um, and that for me has always been a good like safety net to know like, all right, this is where my highlights are. This is where this will be where my midtones are, and I know my shadows are here. And I think working that way has kind of made me feel just more confident overall shooting 16, but also it kind of allows me to approach my lighting a certain way, where I'm sort of at a overall like a darker image globally, which I found to be kind of a pretty easy thing to attain on 16. Whereas like digitally, I think you're worried about a lot of artifacting, and you're worried about a lot of like digital sort of noise and stuff. Maybe noise isn't the right word, but I know when things get into the shadows, it sort of starts to break apart the image. Like it will turn into like magenta or sometimes green, depending on the camera. Especially in the shadows, it'll turn pretty heavy magenta. Whereas like film is just like, all right, if it's just completely black, it's completely black. Like you're not kind of pulling that. Whereas like the highlights are a little bit more forgiving, which is why I tend to expose for the highlights. Um, but all this to say, right? All this to say, I think in shooting 16, it's made me overall overall a much more deliberate cinematographer. I feel like I've when the tone is set to shoot something on film, um, I definitely am much more deliberate compared to digital, and I think that sort of mentality and thought process is something that's very easily carried over into my digital workflows, and sort of especially doing like commercial interviews or like that sort of thing. I 16 has sort of given me a new level of like discipline that I otherwise wouldn't have had before. And I think in shooting exclusively 16, the past like 30 days or so. I think it's been a really eye-opening experience, in terms of the discipline that I'm able to have, and also the just overall capability of the images that I'm able to produce. And it's been a really fun challenge.